This last week, Shannon and I were in a place called Lakeland, Florida, for a gathering of the evangelical remnant of the Presbyterian Church USA. And it was great to be with friends and colleagues and make some new friends of those of us kind of on the front lines talking about what it looks like to do mission and ministry in our own context. I was not vaguely aware. I was made very aware of my age at this conference. When all of a sudden we're in this big room and the leadership from the front said, we'd like every pastor under the age of 50 to meet on the front lawn because we're going to be playing some games or something like that. And I looked at my friend and I was like, our generation just got skipped again. I mean, us Gen Xers, like we are just leaped over by boomers and millennials. Like they could care less, right? So anyway, I was like, well, I guess I'm over 50, so I am not invited. Well, anyway, so this conference is in Lakeland, Florida, which is basically, anybody been to Lakeland, Florida? It's the home of Publix. It's where Publix grocery stores are found. Anyway, just some random things you all need to know on a Sunday morning, okay? Anyway, so your options to get to Lakeland, you either fly into Tampa or you fly into Orlando. It's about halfway between both of those places. And so Shannon and I decided we were going to fly into Tampa because 30 minutes from Tampa is St. Petersburg. And there's a very well-known museum in St. Petersburg, Florida. Does anybody know whose art is hosted in St. Petersburg, Florida? The choir knows. That was impressive. Salvador Dali. Now, if you all are familiar with Salvador Dali, you will know that I had a little bit of trepidation about spending a day in a museum that is just filled with Salvador Dali art. He was a 20th century surrealist, definitely one of the most influential artists of the 20th century. But he painted these sort of abstracts and weird landscapes. Can y'all picture some, like these melting clocks or watches rather? And I was sitting there going, this is going to be a really interesting museum to visit. But as I walked through there, I was stunned by what an incredibly gifted artist he was. He painted in so many different dimensions and in so many different ways. And yes, he was eccentric, and yes, he was a surrealist, and yes, some of his images are really weird. I will give you that. But as you get to the end of the exhibit, there are these massive canvases that he painted, 9 feet wide, 13 feet tall. I mean, to look at those on a wall was simply it blew my mind. He has one of the Last Supper in this sort of space age, surrealist style of Jesus there. And if you know something, when images, when they're that large, it's like looking at the stained glass windows. Like if you stand up right close to them, you really don't get any perspective. But stepping back from those images, I was just amazed at the giftedness, the brilliance, if you will, of the work that he did. I mean, I will have to admit, I am amazed by any sort of art and any sort of architecture, right? Like these cathedrals, like when you see these great and incredible spaces, my brain just simply I can't even fathom how people see those things, capture those things, build those things. I said to my wife, who is an artist, I was like, how do you paint a canvas that's 13 feet tall and 9 feet wide? Like, are you on a ladder doing that? Or is it on the ground? Like, and how do you have it in your head to make it all work? There is something about art and architecture that captures us, that draws us in. In our text this morning, we're going to be looking at Mark chapter 13, which it's hard for me to believe. We started the Gospel of Mark way back in January. We're now in the 13th chapter. There's only 16 chapters in the Gospel of Mark, which means Easter is 3 weeks away, if you want to do the math on that. But what's happening in Mark chapter 13 is the disciples are wandering around the temple area. And they're looking at this temple that Herod had built. And it is amazing to behold. Historians tell us it was the largest temple constructed during that time. bigger than the actual temple that Solomon had built, and probably more grandiose. And they're walking around, and they're looking at this architecture of this temple. And in Mark chapter 13, I just want to give us a little context of what our text is going to be about here in just a moment. They're having this conversation with Jesus. So we read this. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." So you have to imagine the disciples walking through the temple courtyards and looking up. Herod had been building this temple, by the way, for 50 years, and it was still under construction. It was enormous in its magnitude. "Do you see all these great buildings?" replied Jesus. And then this is where things get weird. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." And then we just kind of take a pause. And then they're at the Mount of Olives in verse 3. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, so they could still see the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled?" So if you make your way through Mark chapter 13, and I will recognize, and if you all have been reading it or you're going to read it this next week, it is a little bizarre, okay? It's a little bit Salvador Dali-esque, okay? There's like some apocalyptic stuff in here. There's some prophetic stuff in here. There's future stuff in here of Jesus making this bizarre statement about how the stones will not be left standing. And what's happening in Mark chapter 13 is there's really two different conversations going on. One is going to be about the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, which you may recall happens in 70 AD. So this great building that Herod had built, spent 50 years building, spends a few more years after Jesus' death and resurrection. Eventually the temple is going to be torn down. So when Jesus is talking about this in the beginning of Mark chapter 13, he's referring to the temple, he's referring to Jerusalem. But then as the conversation goes on, he moves from simply talking about this abomination, this destruction that's going to happen within Jerusalem, to then talking about the end of times, to talking about what it's going to be like when he returns. And so that's what we're going to spend some of our time talking about this morning. So we're going to be Mark chapter 13, starting at verse 24. As Jesus kind of now transitions from talking about what's going to happen with the temple and Jerusalem in AD 70 to talking about the day when he returns. "But in those days, following that distress," so following what has happened, "the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds and from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." And then these words, "Be on your guard, be alert. You do not know when that time will come. It's like a man going away. He leaves his house, puts his servants in charge, each with their assigned task, and tells the one at the door to keep watch. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight or when the rooster crows or at dawn. If he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch." Now, there are some of you who are here this morning and you're like, thank goodness we're going to do a deep dive on the end of times. And there are some of you in this room who are saying to yourself, dear God, please do not let Paul do a deep dive on the end of times. We're going to talk a little bit about it, But what I want to make sure that we understand, what I think is so important for us and what is so important in this text, is that Jesus is bringing up this theological understanding of a word that we would use that is called eschatology. The eschaton. And so the eschatology, when we're talking about this, the eschaton is about the last things. Right? If you take that word eschatology, eschaton meaning last, the word eschatology, which is the word logos, which is words or study, it's the study of the last things, the very last things. And what I want to suggest for us to make sure that we understand is that Jesus is concerned about the end times. He is concerned about whatever is going to happen when the trumpet sounds, when we are restored, when all is made new. And my encouragement in this, and what I want to encourage you all with, is this important reality that Jesus is in charge of this. That no matter what it is that is going to happen, Jesus is in charge. He is the one making the decisions. Because I have to tell you something. I don't want humankind making the decisions for what's going to happen in the end. Personally, I don't trust you, okay? Maybe that's impersonally, I don't trust you. But not just you, but if we look at historically and how often we have said, oh, humankind is progressing, and aren't we so much better now, and aren't we so much more advanced, and haven't we accomplished all these great things, and haven't we right? Like on and on and on and on. I simply don't trust my future. I don't want to trust my future to humankind. Because I'm not sure that humanity is going to redeem all these things. I am not convinced that humanity is going to restore all these things. When I think of the eschaton, when I think of eschatology, when I think of the final thing, I want Jesus to be in charge of that. Not you. Nothing personal at all, okay? But I just don't trust humankind. But I trust Jesus. And so for me, that's very important when I start thinking about this end of time. Now, something else that is very important to me is that I do think it is a mystery. Now, for those of you who are waiting for this sermon, and if you know me well, you know I'm not going in this direction at all, okay? But if you want to hear me talk about premillennialism, postmillennialism, millennialism, panmillennialism. You know what panmillennialism is? It's all going to pan out in the end, okay? That's my millennialism right there. That's the one I land on. If you want to hear about tribulation, if you want to hear about rapture, if you want to hear about who's going to be left behind, I have to say to you, I don't know. There are some things that are a mystery. And there are a lot of people who like to think about these things, who like to write about these things, and that is great and that is fine. It's just not where I am. I tend to land here, which is Deuteronomy 29:29. And by the way, this is not a cop-out, because we are going to still keep talking about this topic, okay? Deuteronomy 29, verse 29 says this: the secret things belong to our God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may follow all the words of this law. The secret things belong to God. That's what Jesus says when he's looking to that end of times. He says, God knows. God's got this all sorted out. But notice this also says that we have some responsibility. We still participate in it because things have been revealed to us and to our children so that we might be obedient to God's law. So, yes, there is mystery. Yes, we don't have it all sorted out. And we're going to keep going because I think there are some important things in this text that we need to understand. Jesus says, in that day, the Son of Man shall return. This is a direct idea from Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. It's actually the only time in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus is referred to as the Son of Man. This is what we read. In my vision at night, so Daniel's having this vision, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days. He approached God and was led into his presence. This is a vision that Daniel's having. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. I saw a vision of one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. As Mark describes it, he says coming in the clouds of heaven. Coming with, coming in, very similar concepts there. This takes us back to the Old Testament. This takes us back to Exodus. Takes us back to the very power and presence of God when God was traveling with the nation of Israel. A cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. The technical term that they use for this is it's the Shekinah glory of God. It is the very essence of his holiness. And when he's traveling with the people of God, as the people of Israel are making their way from Egypt to the promised land, he's traveling with them in the cloud. And so when Daniel has this vision of the Son of Man coming in the clouds or with the clouds, this is the very representation of Jesus with the people. And we need that power and we need that presence of God. So when Jesus is talking about the Son of Man coming in the cloud, he's saying, I am bringing my glory. I am bringing my essence. When I return, that is coming with me. Because ever since the garden, remember we're told in Genesis that in those days before the fall, God's walking with them. God's talking with them. The very presence of God, his holiness, his essence is there in the garden with the people, with Adam and Eve. And then sin breaks everything. Sin distorts everything, which is why I don't trust humankind. But Jesus says, there's a day coming when I'm going to come in the cloud. When I'm going to come and I'm going to restore all things. And this is the good news. Now it's interesting here, as Jesus tells this, there's no discussion of judgment. There's no discussion of resurrection. There's a whole bunch of things that aren't mentioned, and I'm not saying there's not going to be judgment, because I believe there is going to be judgment, but there's a lot of things that aren't mentioned. But what Jesus is driving at is saying, do you understand something? Whenever that day comes, I'm coming in glory. I'm coming to redeem. I'm coming to make right all the things that have gone wrong. I am coming to restore creation. Surprisingly, and this has stumped theologians forever, so I'm not even going to try and make an argument for it, because Jesus basically says, I'm not even sure when it's going to happen. Personally, I think that's helpful for me, because we always talk about Jesus being fully God and fully human, right? So we actually get to see his humanity there, because God hasn't obviously in his human form revealed all of that to him. I don't have time today to unpack that. You can ask David Levy at Sunday school about that, have him talk to you about that, explain that whole concept to you, okay? But here's the deal. We've said all these things, but Jesus says, you have work to do. He says, in light of me returning one day. By the way, they like to hem me in right here. Like I feel like I need to move. It's okay. I'm also old, so it's okay. It's all right. We're all good here. Jesus says this numerous times, probably 4 or 5 times at least, in Mark chapter 13. He says, keep watch. Be on your guard. Be awake. Don't fall asleep. Keep watch. Now, sometimes our Christian culture, we spend too much time, I think, watching for the signs of Jesus' return. I lived in Texas for 12 years. Man, there was a lot of second coming theology in Texas. There were billboards about when Jesus was going to return. And I'm like, I don't think you've read the scriptures. There were all of this stuff. I don't think Jesus is saying, keep watch for signs of my return. I think he is saying, keep watch for the work that God is calling you to do. Don't fall asleep on it. Don't get distracted. Be prepared. First Peter talks about being prepared in season and out of season to make a testimony. I think we just need to be prepared in season and out of season, period. I love the imagery that comes out of Isaiah 58. I don't have the whole text up here. It's a fairly lengthy text, so I'm not going to read all of it. But I like words that paint images. Maybe that's why I enjoyed some of Salvador Dali's stuff, because in those images, I'm seeing and I'm hearing something. And so in Isaiah 58, in verses 11 and 12, he talks about our task. He talks about how when we're doing the things that God wants us to do, God will satisfy our hearts. That doesn't mean you're going to get everything that you want. It does mean you'll get what you need. And so as Isaiah looks forward, this is written 700 years before Jesus is born. But he's looking at the people. And he's saying, I think, the same thing. You have work to do. You don't bring the kingdom ultimately, but your work helps to point to the kingdom. This is Isaiah chapter 58, verses 11 and 12. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. And now this. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins, will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called a repairer of broken walls, a restorer of streets with dwellings. Just leave that there for a second. There we go. I want you to look at that very last sentence, last 2 lines. You will be called a repairer of broken walls, a restorer of streets with dwellings. In my mind, this is right here, right there. This is a part of our mission. I think Jesus is saying, be alert to places where you see broken down walls, where you see streets. We talked about this a little bit last week of the Jericho Road. Where can you restore the dwellings? Keep watch. Be alert. We can take that off the screen now. Thank you for that. How do we do justice, as Micah 6:8 says, love mercy, and walk humbly with God? I think this is what Jesus is saying. That's why he keeps saying, be on your guard, be awake, don't fall asleep, because you're going to remember in a couple of chapters what's going to happen when Jesus goes out to the Garden of Gethsemane and Peter and he takes the disciples with him. And what happens? They completely fall asleep. Do they not remember what Jesus said 6 or 7 times in Mark chapter 13 where he says, stay awake, keep guard, don't fall asleep, be alert, all these things? Because they are just like, I won't say you, they're just like me. They get distracted. They get tired. They get weary. They focus on the wrong things. I remember years ago, this is how I know an important lesson has been taught in my brain when I can remember something from 30 plus years ago. Thank you for whoever just said, wow. I'm old, okay? So I am sitting, it was my first year at Princeton Theological Seminary. There's a guest lecturer, a guest professor, a guest preacher. I don't remember exactly what he was. He is from Eastern Europe. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. This is 1990. He is sitting here preaching and teaching, and I would say chastising a bunch of elite intellectual students who call Princeton Theological Seminary their home. And he says to us, do you realize what a privilege it is to sit around and discuss things like eschatology and theology and philosophy, and to sit in your nice, neat little rooms on this beautiful campus of Princeton Theological Seminary, and to go up to your ivory towers and to discuss all these great and wonderful things, while at the same time people in Eastern Europe need the gospel? You just simply, and I don't think he was quite as vocal as I'm being. He was much more pastoral. But it's how I heard him saying it in my brain, right? Saying, you are distracted. Theology is great. Philosophy is great. Eschatology is great. Studying your scriptures is great. But do not miss the least of these. Do not forget who is most important in all of this. Don't be distracted. Don't fall asleep. That's been 30 years. Still echoes in my head. Keep repairing the walls. Keep looking for dwellings that need to be rebuilt. Keep looking for lives that need to be rebuilt. But some of us get anxious about the second coming. Some of us get anxious about this sense of judgment because, folks, judgment is written into the book. But I want to remind you of the one who took on the ultimate judgment, and that was Jesus. The skies were darkened. The curtain in the temple was torn. Death, darkness reigned. And then 3 days later, Christ rose from the grave. He took the darkness, he took the death, so that we might have the life. And so we keep looking, we keep watching, we keep awake. I wrap up with a quote from Frederick Buechner, one of my all-time favorite authors, who describes this understanding of Jesus as judge. He says this: the New Testament proclaims that at some unforeseeable time in the future, God will ring down the final curtain on history, and there will come a day on which all of our days and all the judgments upon us and all our judgments upon each other will themselves be judged. And then this line: the judge will be Christ. In other words, the one who judges us most finally will be the one who loves us most fully. The one who judges us most finally will be the one who has loved us most fully. Pray with me. Lord, we need your redemption. We don't trust the end of things to us. And Lord, for that I am extremely grateful, because I need you. I need your goodness and your grace. We need your goodness and your grace. We need your forgiveness. We need your hope. We need your joy, and we need your love. So Jesus, be with us. We ask and pray in your name. Amen. I forgot the two questions. We're going to throw those up on the screen for you really quick. First question: where can you repair some broken walls this week? Where can you restore some houses, some streets with dwellings? And the second one's around a mystery. Is there something you don't understand in your life? That's what Deuteronomy 29 says. We don't get it, understand it all. But is there something going on that you need to entrust to God? Amen.